Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Girish was, as people may know, has been a fantastic student. When you think about that, people may have different talents, and but we can talk about this later. So the topic is exchange rate insulation puzzle. It is, I think, one of the first time I present this paper. Will circulate as a draft soon. And it has been a very interesting learning experience for us. It's a joint paper with Kik Huster, Gernot Müller, Sebastian Smith, to learn more the empirics and bring the empirics to bear on recent theoretical development, like the discussion about dollar pricing. So let me first of all say that this is not a paper that reflects the views of the ECB, because Sebastian is officer there, research officer. So, what is it? So the question is a classic question. Do exchange rates help insulating economies from foreign shocks? No, you can have very articulate views coming from the classics. In this list, you see in the first bullet point, Johnson is missing. There is a beautiful set of slides and paper by Obspelt, thinking about all the arguments against a flexible exchange rate, which has also a part on the insulation. There is also a new version of it, like in Gopinath et al. In the AR paper. If you look at the impulse responses in one of the figures, you see that the answer is yes, like you have a shock abroad. The output gap at home does not quite move. And the theoretical work done with Luca De Dole and Sylvain Leduc, or the paper by Mukin and actually the paper by Egero and Mukin takes a little bit of a different perspective, but in my work, there is quite a bit of insulation there. So what are we talking about? If you think of a drop in foreign demand, a global recession, or a contractionary policy shift abroad, with a exchange rate peg, you are sort of linked to the monetary stance abroad. You need to shadow the monetary stance abroad. With the flexible exchange rates, you are free to choose what to do. Okay, so you could, in principle, boost the domestic economy, depreciate the currency, and the combination of this could give you insulation, right? Remember, this shadowing the foreign monetary stance is especially painful in a secular stagnation framework, like, because, in a way, if you're a small open economy pegged into the euro and the euro goes to the zero lower bound and they stay there, fixing the exchange rate, you're basically going to import the deflationary drift from the foreign economy. So like, in principle, it could work very well to be able to choose your own monetary stance and link your inflation from the deflationary drift. I'm not going to talk about the zero lower bound today because it's something more basic I want to show you, but keep that in mind. So what is the empirics? So this is the model. First of all, this is the model that you find in the AER on the dominant currency crisis. To the left of this graph, you see the transmission of a monetary contractionary monetary shock in the center country, which is called USA. And you see that the contraction, so that when the US contracts, there is a huge drop in output gap, in output, while abroad in G and R, the other two countries, which are small open economy, output gap, sorry, the output almost does not respond, right? Now, if we take their codes and we condemn one of the two, our country to fix the exchange rate to the US. And you see immediately that while the floating rate guys are actually unscathed, actually they even do better in terms of output, the fixed exchange rate guys tank, the output tank with the US. So we have the two lines, the cyan and the blue are basically superimposed. So this would be, say, just go flex, right? You want to insulate, go flex. In a floating exchange rate, it pays to go flex.
A quick question, Giancarlo.
Yeah.
So the shock originates in the US, right?
Yeah. Well, in the country called U for
Yeah,
US. Yeah.
yeah.
We're talking about transmission. Now we think about the euro and the other countries around the euro, the US and the other country in the global economy. The shocks can be many, can be monetary, can be credit, can be supply. We consider a bunch of shocks. So what we do is the following. Okay, there is quite a bit of work on the US, much less work on Europe. And Europe, in a way, it is a regional dominant currency. So, and also we were motivated to look at the euro area because, there is this argument that US is really affecting the global conditions. So looking at the regional arrangement, we were sort of trying to see whether there is also this global spillover, spillback effect at global level instead of at the regional level. So we look at the euro area, a bunch of shocks originating in the euro area, and we look at 20 neighbor countries conditioning on exchange rate regime, pegs versus float. We have a large data set of 5,000 observations and a large variation of exchange rate regime across time and space. I'll show you, this is very important. These countries shift exchange rate regimes, and we think it's important to have a methodology to account for the shift. No methodology is perfect, but we sort of like ours, and we experimented with that a long time ago with the paper with Andre Meyer on the fiscal multiplier, using a dummy variable approach that I'll show you in a second. So here is the result, the set of results. Spillovers tend to be sizable. So what happened in the euro area affects the neighbor country, the usual, the catching a cold when the center sneeze effect. And to our surprise, the exchange regime does not matter. So this is what we call exchange rate insulation puzzle. It's basically, the behavior of this country is basically almost the same. So we want to stress that we really look at the regional dominant currency, because that is sort of what is in the data, and that is what brings us closer to the current debate, promoted especially by the IMF, that we live in a world dominated by a few currencies in which trade is invoiced, hence, which is a little bit of a passage, hence priced. Price are set in dollars. Here prices are set in euros. And you see, this is for import and export. You see that there is a strict correlation between the share of export and import going back and forth with the euro area and the share of invoicing in euro. So there is a sense in which the euro is a dominant currency. Firms in euro, in these countries, invoice and price in euro. Now, it is a bit controversial whether invoice is also pricing, but for example, I did a study on Brexit where we have invoicing information in every single trade for the UK, so 10 million observations. And we show, especially around Brexit, that actually it makes a difference for unit values, for prices, whether the trade is invoiced in dollar, in pound, or in other currency, or in euros. No? So we have this, there is a sense in which, but then I'll make some publicity of the paper later, but we also find other interesting stuff, like firms usually switch invoicing, they use multiple invoicing, but that's a different paper. Let's go ahead and say that for the time being, we have a prevalence of euro pricing in the area. So what about the theory? So we have a two-country model, New Keynesians, and we look at basically a small country versus the large country as the neighbor effect. and we distinguish peg and float. And the key variable is monetary policy, of course, inflation targeting. So, and this is the main point. If the small country, as it should, based on results from theory, target domestic inflation, okay? Think of domestic inflation as stabilizing marginal cost in domestic currency. So you stabilize marginal cost. If the small country target domestic inflation and float, then there is some auto spillover, but the basically the exchange rate really free monetary policy, and monetary policy can basically stabilize the economy. The output spillover comes from the fact that potential output is a function of global shock, so it may fall a little bit, right? But what really is important is that you don't have any additional problem in terms of output gap unemployment. So there is insulation. And even with the dominant currency pricing, you have some insulation, although, of course, the fact that the exchange rate does not help you, that does not change global demand by adjusting the price, there is some effect on the levels. Whenever the exchange rate does not do its job by redirecting demand across countries, you need to work on the level. So there is a little bit of effect on output, but very little, as I show you with the picture before. There is basically insulation. Completely different is the picture if you look at the CPI inflation targeting, okay? So basically, once the countries set its eyes on the CPI, then there is basically no difference between a peg and a floater, okay? And this is surprising, but very strong. This is actually true also under producer currency price and under other different arrangement. So what happened is that when the country targets CPI, the monetary policy become less accommodative, right? It start to lean against the depreciation, and there is basically it become more contractionary. So there is more, a monetary cycle. Countries tend to move more together in terms of monetary stance, and the propagation kills insulation. Okay, if you think about it, it sort of makes sense. You have imported inflation, you react to it. So you sort of, and remember also in these models with Calvo pricing and everything, the pass-through is never 100%, right? So even because there is some adjustment, even if you have dollar pricing, the pass-through of a shock on your imports is not 100%, is lower. So it's not mechanical. What I'm saying is that something in the model that sort of bring the monetary authority to lean against the exchange rate in a way that sort of they lose power in terms of stabilization. So for us, the exchange rate puzzle in light of this result is why is it that monetary policy accept larger output fluctuation? Why is it? No, they could in principle insulate. They don't. And in these models, the reason why they don't is because they prefer CPI inflation targeting. But this is not what we have as an optimal policy in many specification of the model. So of course, we are standing on the shoulder of giants. There is a lot of work on this. But the work on the empirical work, systematic empirical work on the exchange rate regime and output performance is not vast. There are very important examples here, also very recent. There is, of course, a long tradition on monetary autonomy and policy framework. The fear of floating, the trilemma, plurality of instruments. The idea that maybe the monetary policy, the conventional monetary policy is not the best way to deal with external shocks. And of course, there is this new literature on the optimal policy with Egorov and Mukin, very nice paper, and a paper that will circulate soon with Luca, De Dola, and Sylvain. And of course, there is the issue of the global financial channel that we have in the data, we don't have in the model yet. And the reason why we don't have in the model is, we want to have like a cleanest position of the two-country model and see whether there is already a statement of the insulation puzzle. Maybe in the financial channel, we'll have the answer to our question. Why is that? What is the trade-off that bring people in neighboring countries to accept output fluctuation, instead of relying on the change rate as a buffer. There is international transmission ECB shock, and there is also some work that I don't quote here on the international transmission US shock new that I just learned yesterday, but that's fine. So the data is 99-2018, Euro area and 20 neighbor countries. We have different exchange rate regimes. Basically, we include Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland to the neighbors of the European Union, the Euro area. And we also record countries that sort of join the Euro. So they go from regimes of flexible, limited exchange rate flexibility into the Euro, okay? So we sort of rely on the classification of Ilseski, Reiner, Rogov. This is like the de facto classification. Then we try, of course, as robustness, many alternatives to that. And the 2% fluctuation bands is more or less the dividing between limited flexibility and floating. So we have something like this. And actually, I want to stop here 1 second just to make sure that everything is clear. So those are the countries that we have in the sample. And this is the regime, right? Where basically, United Kingdom, like my host country, is always floating in this period. So it's a 3. When you go to 2, is less floating, like managed. 1 is a peg, and 0 is basically the union, right? So when they're 0, they go into the Euro. Okay, so as you see, there is variation across countries and variation in time. So there is always this switch if you go down the column, you see this switch. So this is always so of course these switch are endogenous, these switch are, so that there is an econometric and logical issue here. But we like to account for this time varying differences better than the alternative, which would be to take an average and group countries together, because you lose a lot of information there. While here, the idea is to use dummy variables and to use the dummy variables in interaction to see, how the shock propagate differently when you go from 1 to 0, from 3 to 1, right? In this regime. Let me stop here. Any questions so far? I think, is it clear what we are trying to understand? Fantastic. So those countries are exposed to the trade in the Euro area. This is in percentage of GDP, the exposure. As you see, it goes all the way from 7. United Kingdom is a large country with lots of ties to, in terms of GDP, of course, to very high number, right? Hungary 38, Slovenia 30, Czechia 43, Czech Republic 43. So how do we do the shocks? Well, we like to consider a bunch of shocks. One is monetary policy, and it is now increasingly argued that monetary policy shocks come into 2 kinds, the policy shock and the information shock. So we sort of go, with Jaruczynski-Karady to use this high frequency approach, so we basically look at high frequency innovation in the 3 months EONIA interest rate swaps around the monetary events. And we use, sign restriction or other kind of arrangement to identify what is a policy announcement and what is a release of information about the economy. So we take, the European Central Bank is designed trying to help identification for academic journals. So they have the press release, and then the press statements and the conference with journalists. So one can use this to get a finer distinction of the shock. We take this 30 minutes or 90-minute windows around the press statement, around the press conference, to look at the reaction of financial market. And we sort of look at the sum of these two for the response. I use that in other papers. It's actually a very useful approach. Like, it makes a lot of sense what you get from this kind of identification. Okay. So, yeah.
So are these shocks country specific, or you could actually respond to shocks in neighboring countries as well?
No, this is only for the euro area. This is like, remember, we could look at shock in the euro area and see how it transmits. So, okay. So those are like a regional shock, if you want, from the center country. No? And of course, in the case of monetary policy, when stock market and interest rate go opposite, you think it's a monetary shock. When they go the same way, you think it's information shock. That's very simple.
So if there is a US dollar shock, then are we assuming that all countries take it in the same manner, or is there?
No, we hope that these shocks are orthogonal to what happened in the US, right? I mean, we can check that, but the point is that we look at the transmission of euro area specific shock. Then, of course, there is the global, but this is the whole point of identification. I'll try to see what is specific to the area.
Giancarlo, quick question. So when you're looking at the reaction, what is the kind of reaction that you're looking at?
Oh, I look at the spillovers on a bunch of so we take the shock in the euro area, and for all the other countries, we look at the reaction of industrial production, prices, export, interest rates. So it's really a paper about spillovers, no? So what happened to the neighbor country when the euro area is hit by shock? And we look at three kinds of shocks. One is monetary policy shock. The other one is information shocks. And the last one is the so-called credit shocks a la Gilchrist, which is, basically the spread between papers, bank and non-banking papers, and the interest rate in Germany. Okay, so bank and non-financial corporation, we look at the spreads in the bond market, and we look at shocks to the spread. Now, of course, the spread is endogenous, there is complicated things, but there is this argument by Gilchrist first, and then Griske and Moljon specifically for the euro area, that a recursive VAR specification, meaning taking shocks as those movements in the spread that are not explained by contemporary movement in the other variables in the system, are actually a good, a good approximation of exogenous variation of the spreads, which is actually the recursive specification of the VR is, gives you more or less the same result as sign restriction, as FAVAR, and other. So we do all that in a robustness. So to make a long story short, we had two main things: monetary policy shock, information shock, and credit shock, credit condition shock. And we want to see, by the way, in the back of the paper, we have supply shock. So we try really everything. Those three is the one that provides the best, a cleanest representation, what to say. Well, none of the other shock gives a different result. So how do we do the spillover? The spillover, we use a local projection a la Jourdain. Oscar has become very much a standard in the Oscar Jourdain standard in the literature. So we just look at direct estimate of the impulse responses from the shock, assuming that, given that it is orthogonal, conditional on the change rate regime. Okay, so you see, take this X. X could be output, industrial production, CPI, whatever you want to put there, it will be a function of the shock epsilon, right? But you see that the shock is basically conditioned on the exchange rate regime. Could be a float, this I function is 1, or a peg if this I function, so if I function is 0. So there is the peg here, and there is the float here, okay? And then, of course, we have a little bit of controls there, which is lag-dependent variables and shocks in the baseline. So the shock, as I told you, the one I'm going to show you is monetary policy, information, and spread. And we display confidence interval 68 and 90%. So this should answer your question, Girish, no? This is the kind of spillover effect. So here, let's move. What happened when there is a contraction in the euro area? Well, you know, like, let's go down this column. The industrial production falls, check. Unemployment goes up, check. There is very little effect on the CPI. And there is this strange result that the one-year rate increases at the beginning and tends to fall. This is common to other studies. But you know, like basically the one-year rate goes with the contraction, apart from the beginning. There is a strong appreciation of the euro, a contraction and monetary shock, and there is a fall in the log export over import. Okay, there is a fall in the log export over import. So let's see how it propagates. Industrial production goes down both in the pegging country and in the floating country. Remember, I should say, in the countries that at the moment peg, in the countries that at them in the year they float, right? Because there is no clear distinction between pegging and floating, they switch. Unemployment shadow, you know, basically it goes the same way. Interesting. The inflation, there is no real difference. You see, like, again, the reaction, there is no clear pattern that separate the two. The one-year rate, sorry, here the delta policy rate is basically the rate in the country minus the rate in the euro area. So when there is a contraction in the euro area, there is more of a contraction in the peg, more of a contraction in the float. So, like, you know, there is like a sort of monetary cycle with a revenge, with a vengeance you want to increase even more. And in the peg, of course, so like this is the effective foreign exchange currency value of the euro. We look for peg and float to the bilateral with the euro to be clean. And of course, in the peg, there is no much change. In the float, there is some depreciation, but you know, you expect a depreciation, but not dramatic. And remember, the reason is that one of the reasons is that the interest rate follow plus, no? Move in the same direction even more. And the import-export, if anything, it's interesting because you see, like, exports go up. So in a way, the trade channel help insulation, right? So the trade channel is there, that the appreciation of the euro makes this country to export more, right? The transmission goes in the direction we teach our students, but not enough to avoid the drop in industrial production and the increase in unemployment. So the insulation policy is interesting because, sorry, let me finish. Insulation policy is interesting because it tells you that it's not really that the trade channel, at least the sign goes well, is really something about the monetary stance that make this insulation puzzle exist. Sorry, somebody asked a question. I don't know.
Sorry, Giancarlo, just wanted to know what's the x-axis? Is it in months or
months?
Months.
Sorry, all the shocks are months, except I forgot to tell. All the shocks are months except the credit, which is quarterly.
Excuse me, can I ask a question here?
Please.
You just wonder how you can take into consideration of the potential impacts from other economies like the US or China, big traders.
Oh yeah, like this is an excellent question. So remember, this is a matter of identification. If you identify the shock, I mean, as long as the shock is well identified and is specific to the euro area, the methodology should be clean of that. Now, I forgot what we did, but of course we check this, you know, how much you can predict of this shock with global factors. But in principle, we are clean on that. This is an important issue. Like in other places, we may think of using FAVAR or other stuff a little bit to make sure that we clean from that. But so far, I am mildly confident, despite my skepticism for identification in general, mildly confident that we captured something.
Giancarlo, a quick follow-up. So, I mean, here the assumption to some extent is that the shock propagates only to the production channel, but could it also contain information of some sort? And look, some other countries, the Euro region is doing that, perhaps.
Oh yeah. You are introducing the next slide. It's exactly like, let's say that this information coming. So let's try to extract the information aspect. And you see, it is then, this is the transmission information. And so you're saying this may not be, so it's a little bit strange, no? That information is disembodied from economic activity, right? Information must be embodied in trade, right? So, but in terms of information, you have, you know, a shock that increases industrial production in the euro area, increases the same thing, the same way, industrial production in the other. It moves unemployment the same way. Notice no difference again between peg and float here. Of course, you know, there are a little bit of a difference, but you know, it's really amazing how close the pattern is in the transmission. The euro area HIP, you know, like you have a little bit of a deflation from the appreciation of the you have a let me check first. You have a little bit of a depreciation of the euro. So you have a little here coming to the HIP, you have a little bit of the same fall in the prices, but again, the same peg and float. And the policy rates move a little bit differently between float and pegs, but not dramatically different. You see, like there's this dynamic here, but otherwise it's the same kind of response. And again, you have a fall in the price of the euro that distinguish the flow from the peg, but no much difference in terms of export and imports. Again, they are basically the same pattern. If we go to the euro area credit shock in terms of spreads, so let me stop here. Any question about this? This is basically the information shock. This is basically, remember what it is, like we look at the shocks using high frequency around the announcement and discussion in the press conference of the ECB, and we look at movements in prices, basically when you know, like stock prices and rates move in the same direction. We think of that as, I mean, Jaroczynski Karady argue that that is a sign of information, not a sign of shock to policy rates. Okay, credit shocks, spreads basically, you know, like borrowing cost relative to the Bund with a recursive identification. You have, you know, increasing borrowing cost kill industrial production, raise unemployment in the euro area. They do exactly the same thing. No difference, substantial difference between float and peg. No much difference in the inflationary result. So there's a little bit of the go down at the beginning everywhere. Policy rate seems to move, more, or at least that doesn't follow. If you think of if you think of a reaction in policy in rates in the euro area by cutting rates, so there's a borrowing cost increase, rates are cut. It doesn't follow here, like the policy rate are either not move or are increased in the rest of the countries, irrespective of exchange rate regimes. And there is a depreciation of the euro, a depreciation of the other countries. So there's a little bit of shadow in the exchange rate. And export increase from the euro, increase also on the export over imports. But remember, it's a little bit of a combination of the exchange rate, but also of the fact that you have a recession in the country, so import go down. Okay. So what about financial cycles? No, what about maybe we should think not only in terms of a traditional New Keynesian model, macro model, but also kind of additional ways of propagation coming from the global financial cycles or the regional financial cycle. So what we do, we sort of include a bunch of variables that are usually considered in the studies. And with the motivation that there is an impact of US monetary policy on the global financial variables that move the exchange rate and move capital flows, right? So there could be a contraction in capital flows and industrial production globally, and countries, regardless of the monetary regime, this create a dilemma also for floating rate countries, and basically it's a shock that kill everybody, independent of their monetary regime. So could that be important in explaining the insulation puzzle? So we redo all the analysis, including the VIX, and the V-stocks. Those are two measures, V-stocks based on implied volatility, equities, in the options. So the common measures of capturing uncertainty as perceived by the markets, as control variable in the empirical models. And the results you see here is the blue line, and the graphs also report the red line, which is the result from the previous exercise. So the takeaway I would like you to consider is actually twofold. Number one, these shocks matter. They change the transmission. Second, they don't alter the insulation. They are not responsible for the insulation. The insulation stay there. I mean, even once you control for the shocks, although the intensity of the spillover is different, there is no systematic pattern emerging from peg and float. It looks like having an autonomous monetary policy does not give you an extra kick in, sort of controlling for these negative spillovers and insulate your economy. Okay, so the spillover become basically smaller once we control for the financial conditions, that sort of tells you that we really need to move into models where trade is not the only story, or is not the front runner stories. There's I don't believe in a split. I think that the trade and financial conditions are often very much interlinked, but we need models that sort of account for this part. So as you see, I don't have to repeat what I'm saying. In some cases, actually, the transmission may even change a little bit sign. In the case of information shock, for example, it goes from the positive to the negative. But again, the pattern is exactly the same, right? Let me skip this so we can have more time to discuss the results later. But as I say, it's fascinating. By the way, we had no strong priors when we started this. We actually, we in preliminary work we did looking at the Nordic countries, like comparing Sweden with Denmark, with Norway, with Finland, and especially looking at the zero lower bound episodes, we had the idea that actually floating rates made a difference. And I still believe that under the zero lower bound, floating rate may really make a big difference. But when we extended this to more like encompassing all the periods, the surprise is that they don't seem to be a strong discriminatory factor. Okay, so let me stop here and see, because then we need to go into the theory. So let me stop here and see whether you have any question about this or any comment before I give you
a small note, Giancarlo. So the I think the previous slide or the slide before that, where you were showing the drop in I think before this, yes. So the previous one, yep. So out here, isn't this kind of counterintuitive that in the float you have a pretty sharp decline in industrial production as opposed to the peg? You'd assume the opposite.
Yeah, but that is exactly, that's the insulation pass. Isn't it strange that people have space to use monetary policies to stabilize output gap and they don't use it? That's the insulation puzzle, right? I mean, we say insulation puzzle in a way, we want to keep a little bit away from fear of floating, because we are not completely convinced that these patterns come from an explicit sort of, we're not completely convinced that the problem is that people look at the change rate too much, right? So the fear of floating comes from experiences in emerging markets, especially Latin America, in which the change rate really has been an asset price dominating price setting, policy decision, financial decision. So controlling the change rate was a big deal there. So the fear of floating things is sort of reflecting the fact that people really do not want the change rate to move too much. Here, it could be that, but it could be other stuff, right? It could be that the change rate is the tail of the dog in policymaking rather than it's like the people may be worried about CPI inflation, wage dynamics, but we don't know, no? But whatever it is there, we don't know. I mean, we can have models and ideas, but whatever it is, we want to be a little bit more encompassing, no? So the question, we like to rephrase the question: if you have space to act, why don't you? That's the question, no? Or maybe tell me why you don't have space. I want to know what is it that prevent this action. Okay. So this is the takeaway. There are like so the change rate regime, sizable spillover independent change rate regime, flexible change rate fails to provide insulation. The spillovers depend on financial variables and become smaller once we control for these financial conditions. But again, the insulation is there. So let's try to think about it for 10 minutes using the tool of the New Keynesian's open economy model. Monopolistic competition and sticky prices, good markets, incomplete integrated. There is a bias, home bias. We have complete markets, but for this model, really does not matter whether you have complete market or incomplete market. It matters for the model because, of course, we're sharing impinge on the transmission, but the similar result we can get with the incomplete market bond economy. Difference in size: the euro area is large, the home is small. So the foreign is basically the center and the home is the small open economy. And we allow for different monetary policies. And we compare a setting in which all exports are priced in euros, and prices are sticky, so you have the dominant currency pricing, or all traded goods are priced in the currency of the producer. So the export prices move with the exchange rate. I think I'm going to skip the model. Is actually a very elegant little model with Markov processes. But the whole point, what was really important for us, is to make sure that people understand that part of the shocks actually affect potential output. So some contraction may belong there in the natural rate, right? Because it is, if you have a fall in demand, like, if you think of the Swedish complaint in 2008, 9, 10, that for them, the Great Recession was an external shock to their export. Nobody wanted the trucks they produce. That's okay, but the point is that even in a natural location, you would have a little bit of a contraction because there is less world demand for the trucks. You can correct that by making it cheaper with the change rate, but so there is a sense in which you would like some transmission, right? So we need to capture that in the model. But what are interesting on top of that, what happened to output gap? What happened to the extra contraction that you may want? So this is a model where with dollar pricing, you can have the same product with two different prices, because when the change rate moves, the prices do not move. So you get Hungarian price is different from the same product in Paris, and we call this M, the deviation from the low one price. And as you see in the Phillips curve, the traditional output gap that capture the marginal cost. Basically, these models, Phillips curve is basically marginal cost, wages, productivity multiplied by the market, right? So how do you capture the wage? In open economy, you capture the wage accounting for the fact that given consumption, if imported prices go up, the equilibrium wage rate goes up in nominal terms. So you have an increase in nominal cost, right? Or for a given prices, if you have a portfolio and you get wealth effects, so you get capital inflows, consumption may move. So the international economy goes into the Phillips curve through the wage rate by capturing these two elements, the effect of imported inflation on the wage rate and the effect on wealth moving with international capital flows on the wage rate, the wealth effect. Okay, and of course the second one is crucially dependent on the exchange rate, on the financial arrangement, right? Complete markets, bond economy makes a difference on how shock propagate like that. So this is what this expression here tell you. There is a shock to preference that drives capital flows. There is this M, the low one price, the deviation of one price that determine domestic inflation versus foreign inflation, and there is this S, that sort of gives you the evolution of terms of trade, so the purchasing power, if you want, of your labor in terms of foreign goods and domestic goods. This is resharing. And this is basically the terms of trade. It's fine. Now, the only thing I want to tell you is that this is usually model where eta, this trade elasticity eta, here I cannot do it here. This eta here. When eta is 1, you have the so-called Cullen-Obstfeld economy. So all of a sudden, financial markets are less important in transmitting productivity shocks, because basically you have income and substitution effect that offset each other. The intuition is very clear. If I produce 10% more, but the price of what I sell goes 10% down, from my income perspective, nothing changed. So the terms of trade give automatic risk sharing through the trade channel. This is like, very well-known case, but it's important for us in a second because because of the global cycle. So this is the IS. Again, it's an IS that reflects demand, and the demand is a function of the real rate here. No? But as you see, there is also an element of exogenous preference shocks. You could think of that also, if you want, as impatient shocks, and needs to be corrected. So that the real rate needs to be corrected for the difference between our prices, right? So that's fine. So the exchange rate regimes will be exchange rate peg, no change in the exchange rate, inflation target in terms of PPI, inflation target in terms of PPI, of CPI. Again, this is one thing that is important. So let's think about what would be the potential output response to a shock. And as you see, there is a link between the natural rate of output, potential output at home, and output in the euro area. And this link, the euro area in the model, in the center country, this link is heavily dependent on the trade elasticity. So if the trade elasticity is 1, basically there is a natural insulation, right? Natural insulation. The potential output, the two goods are independent. Think of that. The two goods are independent. So there is a natural insulation of our output, potential output relative to abroad. If eta is less than 1, you get complementarity. So you could have positive co-movement. If eta is larger than 1, you get substitutability, and the co-movement are negative. Now, I've been a strong vocal supporter of the idea of complementarity. Now here, of course, if you think about in terms of preferences, it's a little bit silly. You say, okay, you know, come on, like tea, it's not all about tea and sugar, right? It's like goods, imported goods, there is competitive, there is like a kind of comparative advantage, there could be substitutability. But think of that more as a technology, you know? So if you have a supply chain, in the short run, you get more and more, you have many reasons to believe the output is interlinked and moving together, no, in tandem. Okay. In the special case of eta equal to 1, of course, there is it's easier to solve the model, and there is still complementary substitutability, not in the potential output, but in the current output. So, for example, on the dollar pricing, also if potentially you have insulation, the fact that you have nominal rigidities and DCP prevent you from getting there. So you cannot reach natural rate. No? So that there will be some spillover in the output gap, even if potential output spillover at 0. Okay, so do you have any question about this? And for me, like, you know, like a Girish had been injected a substantial amount of this thing, but
yeah, Gianluca,
yeah, tell me.
Can I ask 2 questions about the model? The first one is, it seems to me you just distinguish the CPI and PPI. So is the main source of the difference just from the imported goods? So, or there any, for example, is there any tax introduced into the model?
No, we don't have taxes except those we need to eliminate some distortion that will make the solution in the. But actually, not in this model. This model would have no.
They do you mean that then the main source of the deviation between the two are just from the imported goods? Is that right?
Yeah, it is the way you put nominal rigidities into the imported good.
Okay, so
remember, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. Because I have a second question. Is okay. So I'm considering the consistency between your model and the empirical part. So in this model, okay, is elegant, just the 2-country model, but in empirical part, actually, there are many small neighboring countries. I'm just wondering, okay, so what about the size of the trade within between these small countries and between the neighboring countries and the European Union? So I think that could be a relevant question to your modeling part, right?
Yeah. So let me answer in two bits. I'm going to move this very fast. 1 second. Remember, this is a multi-country model from GoPeanut, and this is something that whatever we say in the two-country model, we can go and say in this model where you have one country and then other, more countries. It is true that multi-country models like this still assume symmetry. Every other country is a small country. Okay, so you would like to have more asymmetries. But what I'm saying is the fact that everything I say in this two-country model, I can find also in the multi-country model à la GoPeanut, where everybody's small, right? And this is important for me because I want to see whether, in a way, the two-country model and the small country work in a similar direction. They are not exactly the same, right? Because they have spillover, spillback, and quite a bit.
Yeah, that's
but then
true.
there is a deeper question. Sorry, there is a deeper question, which is what role for heterogeneity in size, maybe risk and everything. So that is a deeper question, and I would like to answer the question in a different model where, together with nominal rigidities, I also have incomplete markets.
Yeah, so
with complete markets, you would have more interaction of pecuniary and demand externalities, right? And becomes much more interesting. I'm working on this. Like we are sort of working on finding meaningful aspect of heterogeneity, and there are many meaningful aspects. So for this model, complete market make heterogeneity a little bit less relevant because financial markets sort of keep things together, right?
So if that is true, can you just just show some evidence by drawing a matrix between country and country and showing, for example, the capital flows or trade between the small neighboring countries and between the small countries and Europe, and show this evidence is quite close to your to model setting.
No, that's what motivates the new generation of model. Those become models that become maybe a little bit closer to policy, true. But again, I would like to write a model which is not cosmetic, where these things are put as to say, oh, look, I have heterogeneity, I have banking, I have this, but that they don't play any meaningful role. I would like to understand what are the trade-offs. But I completely agree with you. But stay with me 1 second, because what I'm saying is that to state the puzzle, this is the kind of model that I think is more efficient, because it's clear, simple. You control for what the effect very, very easily.
Okay, thank you.
So let me show you the simulation model. The simulation results. So I'm assuming complementarity. Okay, so think of these countries having in the short run. So complementarity means basically low trade elasticities here. And trade elasticities are controversial since the beginning of the history of international economics. Like, there are many different ideas. It is fair to say that trade elasticities tend to be small in the short run, tend to be high over larger horizon. They could switch quite a bit. So think of this as sort of a short-run representation, right? And if you think not so much about preferences, because clearly if I buy a Renault, a substitute for a Mercedes, it's not they're not buying the two of them, right? But on the other hand, the supply chain and industrial production tend to create more complementarity, right? Both in terms of competition and in terms of vertical interaction between different stages of production. So I regard this eta less than 1 as a good assumption, but nothing I'm going to say really you know, you could have a version of the model with eta larger than 1 and run into the same kind of issues that I'm going to show. So so you will have you know, this negative output gap coming under DCP. Parameters are pretty standard. We have an inverse of labor supply is equal to 1 because of makes the model more tractable and has other analytical advantages. And some people think it's not such a bad assumption. And trade elasticity is 2/3. Okay, and the openness, those countries are pretty open. And you know, we have inflation targeting. So we are in this model, we don't have Calvo, we have actually Rothenberg. So all prices are symmetric. So we don't want to deal with inflation dispersion. But for describing the economy, it's fine. I mean, if we want to do welfare economics, that would be more complicated. But for describing the economy, the two of them, Rothenberg and Calvo, are very much the same. So here is the shock we consider. We shock the euro area rate, nasty, falling output, falling inflation, big interest rate increase. Okay. The old ECB was not, they had a couple of cases in which they did something like that, but it's fine, like 2008, 2011. So this is the shock. What is the spillover? Sorry, what is the spillover abroad, right? So I want to convince you that really depends on the kind of monetary policy rule applied there. So on the top row, you have the GDP deflator. Think of that as marginal cost in domestic currency. On the bottom, or maybe domestic PPI, and on the bottom, CPI. The blue is PCP, the red is DCP, okay? So here in full pass-through and euro pricing of export. So let's have a look. If the inflation target is PPI, domestic inflation, basically, you know, there is a big difference between peg and float. You see that both in PCP and DCP, there is basically very much insulation. Remember, there must be a little bit of a fall in output because the two goods are complementary and potential output goes down with the shock abroad in a way. But, you know, there is nothing, the contraction here is very small compared to what happened under a peg. And I've written many papers showing that this is what this guy should do. So that is the optimal policy. I mean, approximate better the optimal policy. I do targeted rule, I don't do Taylor rule, but this is, we do targeted rule. But to approximate the optimal policy, this is what you want, not this. Now, switch to CPI targeting, bang. There is almost no difference between float and peg, you see? And this is true for PCP and LCP. And DCP. So again, let me rephrase the question. Why is it, why is it that people do this and not that? Why is CPI, suppose, this is not a question about, it's a question about direction of modeling, I go myself into the model and I solve the model and I say, this should be optimal and people do CPI. So the question is, what is it in the model that I miss that may justify this, apart from, that may justify CPI inflation targeting instead of that? And this could come from, the structure of the model, economic analysis, could come from political, could come from something related to contracts in wages, could come from many places, right? Could come from financial consideration, but the statement in the model is pretty strong. you don't have any insulation if you follow a CPI inflation target. People writing this model should be aware of that. So let me tell you more in detail what happened. So here you get the blue line is producer inflation targeting, producer price inflation target, PPI inflation targeting. The green is consumer price inflation targeting, and the red is exchange rate peg. I just noticed that the green and the red are much closer together than the blue. Okay, so basically a floating regime with the CPI inflation targeting, very strict CPI inflation targeting, is very close to a peg. So what happened to the transmission of output in response to a foreign monetary policy shock? Output is pretty much insulated with PPI inflation targeting. They tank both. Output tanks in the other two cases. Producer price inflation, same thing. Exchange rate, it depreciates under PPI inflation targeting, but nowhere near what happened with, it depreciates with CPI inflation targeting, but nowhere near what happened with PPI inflation targeting. And same thing, consumer price inflation, we have this big increase in the case of producer price inflation targeting, while in the other two cases, you don't have any. So you have this kind of dynamic that you don't see in the PPI and PEG. Interest rate, they move almost the same. I mean, there is a difference, of course, but they move in the same direction, the same order of magnitude with CPI and PEG, not with PPI. Consumption tanks. And net export also have quite of a different. So remember, what I want to stress here is that this is a model where I think I forgot. Sorry, I forgot to. I omitted the very important information. So I apologize. This is the case of PCP, the case of full pass-through. So this is the case in which actually the change rate is your friend, right? The change rate does the switching, so it helps you stabilizing the economy. So yeah, this is the perfect setting for doing the right thing, right? For doing the right thing, the perfect setting for making sure that you are letting CPI inflation move the exchange rate, because that is what you want. You want an adjustment in demand driven by relative prices. And thanks to that, you can actually concentrate on stabilizing output gap, on making sure that you don't have unemployment, and you keep consumption up, right? So if you want, the only irrelevant effect in this world is that you have this burst of inflation at the very beginning, because it's not really inflation. That is an adjustment in relative price, right? It's recorded import inflation that doesn't have any cost for the economy. It's actually what you want to correct relative price. So something's bad. Yeah.
So doesn't that explain the puzzle to some extent, that it might be the right thing to do, but it might not be the popular thing to do, right?
No, could be a political economy issue. Could be. I mean, could be. This is, to me, is fascinating. I speak in terms of almost press-like. Right? So, for example, is a huge discussion in Sweden, huge. You should see the articles if you can read Swedish. I can't, but I have my friends translate for me. Sweden monetary policy is dominated by this game of public opinion, discussion, dialogue with the public opinion that basically say, look, you let the krona go down the top. What do we get it? No, export do not really change much, right? Unemployed. So it looks like the only thing the only thing we get from it is that when we go abroad, everything becomes so costly. But press article of the idea that there is a mismanagement there because the monetary policy. So, like, people say, look, you're obsessed with inflation targeting, you let the krona goes down and inflation is below target. So what's the use? And you know, you should see the response say, well, you know, if the exchange rate did not go down, you would have worse deflation. But all this becomes very complicated, right? So I'm sort of sympathetic to the idea of popular pressure, because we have at least one case studies in which we have a central bank sort of holding the fort, right? Trying to say, look, you know, we are doing the right thing. But it's fascinating, don't you think? It's like a sort of interesting aspect. So like this is basically the case with PCP. So the case in which every country price traded goods in their own currency. So when the exchange rate moves, they do exactly what Milton Friedman was saying. I remember Milton Friedman idea that the exchange rate is a little bit like changing the time of the day on your watch, you know, the hands of the watch during summertime. Like instead of changing all the prices, you can just change the exchange rate and all the prices are correct. This is that world, right? And despite that opportunity to use opportunity to use the correction through exchange rate, doesn't look like if you use CPI, you give it up. That's the whole point. If you use CPI as inflation targeting, you give it up.
So I'll be really interested if you, like, you know, you have the data, and if you could break it down by, say, shocks that are closer to the election period and shocks that are further away, just to get to the political economy aspect of it. That you know, is it a political economy?
Yeah, for some of this country may be true. I mean, not for Sweden, for example, because, but for some of this country there could be. I mean, I never done the political economy studies of the exchange rate, but I'm not saying that is the explanation. I'm just saying that at this point I'm open to. I would like to, you know, there is clearly the financial aspect to model. But this kind of behavior is more interesting, no? Like we live in a world where many things may come into, especially now, no? Where after the Great Moderation, we are rethinking monetary and financial. Let me finish with the so basically what I'm saying is the fact that it really, if you want to look at the data with this model, put CPI inflation targeting, you fit the data in a way. It's the first order, which is, you know, an interesting thing. Why? But you need to impose inflation targeting, knowing that is not the right thing to do, especially in the PCP thing. Now, if you look at DCP, the same picture comes out. Here you can get output gap targeting, black, producer price inflation targeting, blue, consumer price inflation targeting, green, exchange rate peg, red. Again, red and green are very close to each other. I'm sorry, I thought it was 1 hour and a half, but now I realize that it's
just a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, no, I can finish very quickly. So you get exactly the same thing with DCP. And here DCP is a little bit, there is a beautiful quote by Johnson that was brought to my attention by, I don't know whether I can find it, by Opsfeld. Basically, you know, Johnson is very clear on this, the fact that when you think of a floating exchange rate, it's not so much thinking that the exchange rate helps you independently of what you do, right? That it absorbs shock on its own, right? It's more that without the fixed exchange rate constraint on monetary policy, you can use monetary policy. And here, the exchange rate inflation puzzle is telling us that empirically, it doesn't look like there is a big difference between floater and pegger. And in the eye, through the lenses of this model, it looks like the real puzzle is why basically there is a little bit of a CPI target that drives monetary policy. And I conclude again, quoting Sweden, I guess 10 years ago, Rogoff and Carmen Reiner were presenting the de facto classification of exchange rate regime. And before the crisis, Sweden clearly shadowed the euro. So that they were classifying Sweden as pegger. And during the meeting, Lars Svensson raised his hand and say, no, we are not a pegger, we are inflation targeter. And Rogoff say, well, no, according to my classification, you are a pegger. And then they raised his hand, no, we are inflation. So Lars Svensson left the room slamming the door during the presentation, but that is exactly the problem. No? Like if you get CPI targeting very strongly away from zero lower bound and other moments in which things become more complicated, it may well be that you are indistinguishable. Not because you pay attention to the exchange rate, but because the exchange rate as an endogenous variable is driven, or let me make the last sentence. So if you target 2% inflation, I target 2% inflation, we are more or less in the same part of the world, we may end up doing always the same thing. And the exchange rate is very, very, very close to each other. Let me stop here and
okay. So I think since the time is up, I think it's safe to officially end the seminar. But if any of you have any questions, then please stick around. And if Giancarlo is willing, he can answer some queries.
And let me just finish. I would love to see more empirical evidence on this. There is quite a bit of work here and there, but I think it's really a fascinating aspect. Thank you very much for your comment and questions.
So anyone, any questions?
Juliano has one. Emmy?
Emiliano, do you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Yes, two questions in the empirics part. One is, I mean, there are 20 countries. I don't remember exactly which countries those were, but two questions. Do you have data on wages flexibility in those countries? And the second one is data on capital controls.
We could use some of the data from wage or better labor market structure. Clearly, I'm very sympathetic with that. The idea that maybe, you know, if I write a model with wage and, you know, sort of wage rigidities, I may get closer to the CPI inflation target, or if I do the two layer, no, like prices and wage rigidities. So that could be a direction to think about the puzzle. We haven't used it in this paper. I used it that in a paper with Duarte and yeah, like in the case of spillover within the euro area, for example, we found that the transmission of the shock really depends on the structure of the housing market. So we have, that is not so much about output gap, but the composition of aggregate demand. We are working on the wage rigidity, but those are data for the euro area. So no, I take the question. I think it's a very good way to think about it. Capital controls, yes, it's an important aspect. We have not included that. If I remember well, I don't know, at one point there was an idea about doing a robustness, but so far it's not there yet. Those are good suggestions. If we have the data, of course, because that's the issue. How do you?
Any other question?
Yes, Grish, can I have one?
Sure.
Yes, Giancarlo, so I'm just have one question about the empirical part. So I think here the regime, exchange rate regime seems to be important, right, in your regression specification. So the ideal situation is that this kind of the exchange rate regime change could be quite random and exogenous. But just I'm wondering whether the decision of this change could be quite endogenous to the historic volatility or any wrong decisions in the monetary policy and leading to some bad economic performance. That could be possible. And also, if they find, for example, CPI targeting could be quite make the economy vulnerable to the external shocks, then why do they still stick to this if you want to stabilize the domestic economy? So such kind of things. So I'm just wondering whether any decisions in their exchange rate regime could be endogenous, in one word. Yeah.
No, it is a concern. It is a concern. This I've been thinking about this for a long time. It is so all this literature, multipliers, transmission, and everything, spend most of the time trying to figure out how to identify exogenous shocks, right? And that is already a big hurdle. But I think there is another hurdle which is even more challenging, the fact that any exogenous shock will have an effect on the economy which is state contingent. I mean, it's not, like a multiplier state contingent, spillover state contingent, right? So, we know, let me give you the example of the spillover fiscal policy. We have the feeling that in boom is different than in transmission, the multiplier is different in boom and recession, right? So for a given shock, how do you identify the boom and the recession? That is the hard part. And so it's a little bit here the same thing, right? We want to say the transmission is different float and peg. How do we identify float and peg in a econometrically sensible way, exactly because the switch can be endogenous. So this is the best I can do so far. The best I can do so far, but it is an open issue. I think there is something there, at least in a sort of descriptive way, because if you think that the shift is threshold related, so you go up to a point, you stick to something and then you change. So it's fascinating topic for another but let me give you the example again of a zero over bound that we haven't kept in the paper. The zero over bound. So remember, there are two arguments for a nominal anchor, right? Or for the change rate as a nominal anchor, for the CPI as a nominal anchor. One argument is that you buy somehow, you anchor expectation. Or you can buy some credibility. You can try to get people expectation on anchor in the future. That is what sometimes is used for saying that a peg exchange rate may be a good thing. And indeed, we know that if you have a large shock at home, and somehow you keep expectation anchored to the long run prices, the shock never gives you the bad vicious circle of the zero over bound. No? The bad vicious circle of the zero over bound is because you unanchor expectation, or you start to have this dynamic of deflation that is self-feeding, right? So in a way, for a small open economy, pegging to the euro may be a good idea to avoid the domestic shock become really disruptive. However, in a world where the euro is in trouble, it's the other way around, right? When the euro goes into the zero over bound, it drags you down. It's their price, it's their deflation that create deflation in your country. So this is the kind of issues of also the endogeneity, no? So let me, I was too complicated, very simple. If I live in one of these countries, I say, look, I want to sort of stabilize the economy, maybe a peg to the euro might be good, because even if I have idiosyncratic shock, I still keep everything anchored to the price level. So in the logic of the Keynesian model, I keep inflation anchor and I reduce the effect of the shock. I never go to kind of vicious circles, right? Where I lose control. So the peg of the euro can be good. But this is true as long as the currency I peg to works well, right? Because if they have a deflationary spiral, they drag me down. So I'm going to import the recession abroad, also in terms of negative expectation of inflation, right? Of sort of unanchored inflation. So these kind of things are important because, you know, like in a situation like what we saw in the last few years, I think they created a little bit of a reflection on the currency regime. No? Some people, you know, the Swedish were very happy to have the floating rate, although the public opinion complains. But think about, you know, like Norway also. Norway, by the way, never got to the zero bound. But I can see that the endogeneity, there are circumstances in which the endogeneity becomes a true issue.
Yeah. So do you have any policy suggestions for the central bank who is conducting the CPI targeting like Australia and so from your studies?
Well, I mean, like in terms of
I think
it's not, yeah, so
I think he froze, and maybe that has to do with the 1 hour 30 minutes limit.
I think so. Okay, so I think let's stop this, and I'll pass on any questions that you may have, Sean, to Giancarlo then.
I think, yeah, this is my last question. Thanks. No problem.
Thank you,
Take
everyone.
care. Bye.